I thought tonight that we could talk about listening to silence. So in a lot of spiritual traditions, silence is highly valued. And what we commonly take silence to be is just the absence of noise. So we can say, well, it's a silent night. It's a quiet night. I don't hear sounds. And this is one way we can think about silence or use silence as something that's dependent on outside circumstances, whether there's noise outside the body, whether there's man-made noise outside the body. We don't seem to have a problem with natural noises, birds singing. Most people, unless it's maybe a blue jay or a crow, we don't really have a problem with it. Even then, we can appreciate that diversity. The rustling of the leaves in the breeze, we don't seem to mind that. But if we're sitting in our backyard, just enjoying the quiet space in the afternoon, and someone turns on the radio next door and it's loud and we can hear it, we take that man-made noise as a disturbance. So that's how we commonly think about silence is, if they're just, weren't the noises that I don't really want to hear, that would be great. But it's especially attributed to man-made sounds. So at one time in my life, I lived on a houseboat out in the Columbia River in Portland, Oregon. And after I moved in, when the wind was from a certain direction, that houseboat was directly under the flight path of Portland International Airport. And the first night that the planes were coming in from that direction, it was just directly overhead. And it was like, oh my God, this is impossible to sleep with. But somehow the mind over a period of time amazingly learns how to filter out even that powerful a noise. And after a while, I forget, a month or two, you just sleep through it. You get used to it. You get used to that pattern of noise as acceptable. And at the other end of the spectrum, I lived for a while in rural West Virginia a while ago. And when I was first down there, it was the first place that I ever was where there was just no man-made sounds at all. And it was almost a little disconcerting being there with just the absence of sound. There were birds and crickets and other sounds, but just on a really still night, it was just absolutely quiet. And it took about, I don't know, a week or 10 days or something for my ears to stop ringing from the lack of noise. So it's just, that's the spectrum of what we can get used to in the, when we're thinking about sound and silence as an exterior phenomenon. But we can use even that. We can use, being in a quiet space or being out in nature as something to bring us back home, you could say. And the reason I believe that feels good, it resonates with us as humans because it brings us back to something that was prior to the dominance in our everyday lives of conceptual thought and mental noise and stimulus. So just being out in nature when that, what's coming towards us from the outside world isn't man-made. It isn't based on conceptual thought. You know, so the trees are doing their thing. They're conscious beings. They're living their life. They're aware of their surroundings. They lean towards the sunlight. They're intelligent about how they're being here. But they're doing it non-conceptually, it appears. You know, so when you walk out in nature, it's not that nature is demanding that we justify ourselves. You know, it's not evaluating our presence. Right? It's not asking us to justify our worthiness to be there. It's not even asking us to understand, you know, the name of the bird, the name of the tree. I mean, those are man-made impositions on the natural world. But if we're just there being with nature, what we encounter are living beings being exactly what they are. A bird being exactly that bird. A tree being exactly itself, and without apparently, you know, totally absent of the desire to improve itself, or, you know, wish for a better day tomorrow, or, you know, regret, you know, getting rooted exactly where it was rooted. It'll make the best it can. It'll weather any storm from whatever position that it happens to be in. That just simplicity resonates with something in ourselves that's prior to conceptual thought. So when we're out in nature, let's say, and just walking or sitting somewhere, that characteristic of nature can bring us back to our essence, you could say. And what tends to pull us away from that is thought, right? You know, wishing, you know, the day was a little warmer or cooler, or, you know, that I saw a different kind of bird, or that this rock that I'm sitting on had moss on it so it would be softer, whatever our storyline in our head happens to be. So the usefulness of just being out there, other than just the sheer pleasure of it, is seeing, you know, when there's no outside stimulus for mental conceptualization, seeing what our mind does with that. Because it reveals a pattern, right? It can reveal a pattern of wanting to, I don't know, name everything, sort of, you know, fall back on our mental knowledge about nature rather than actually being there, or just escaping altogether and thinking about something that's not happening at the moment, something, you know, some issue from yesterday or 10 years ago, or worrying about tomorrow. Or so it's an opportunity when there's no outside stimulus that requires our mental conception to notice where our mind gets pulled towards. So that's revealing. It's revealing of the kind of patterning that that we've been programmed with, right? So that's useful to see. You know, and trying to make those thoughts or those distractions stop, you know, let's say as a spiritual practice, is really non-productive, right? Because again, it's just one thought fighting with another thought. The thought that, you know, I should be quiet, you know, I should be here, I should be enjoying nature, I shouldn't be thinking. It's all just more thinking, actually. So we can just see that too, the tendency to, you know, want to do it right, want to do it better, improve myself. have the right experience, you know, the right spiritual experience, because I don't know, there'll be a payoff someday. So we can see that tendency of the mind also. So this is useful information. We can see this movement of our mind of, well, this is nice, but not quite as fascinating as thinking about something that I'd really like to think about. You know, some future pleasure, or worrying about something that I really feel like in this moment I need to worry about. You know, again, just being pulled away from that non-conceptual silence that nature survives in, not only survives in, thrives in. So this is one aspect of silence, the most common aspect of seeing silence as something that is happening or not happening outside of ourselves. We're seeking it outside of ourselves. Okay, it can be used to pull us back into that quieter space. But what we notice is the issue really comes back to our own self. I mean, to our own image of ourself and our own thinking mind. So then we practice another kind of activity. We call it meditation, but the idea is basically, you know, falling into a quiet space, a sense of silence. So that's the promise, right? You know, this will settle your mind down. Just sit down in a quiet room, don't talk, and don't think, and there'll be some benefit in doing that. So when often when people come on retreat, one of the things that they say they'd like to experience during the retreat is just to, you know, quiet a busy mind and find a little peace and a little space. But when we sit down to actually do that, it's even more challenging than finding peace out walking around out in nature, because now there's not even a place to park our attention, you know, other than what's happening inside our own head or our own body. So now with the instruction to just sit down and be quiet, we find that thought is happening. Thought is happening when we encounter it for the first time, we're surprised that it's actually a non-stop event. It's like an infinitely long freight train with no gap between one thought and the next thought passing, just one after another. And almost a chain of consciousness when we stop and can trace back where we've come from in a linear sense, even over a period of 5 minutes, we find that our mind has taken us on a whole journey, you know, one thought after leading to another, leading to the next. So when we actually try to stop that, at first we think we can do that, or at least there's a promise of being able to do that. You know, the meditation teacher telling us to, well, just, you know, quiet your mind, just, you know, focus on something else, you know, do a mantra or an image or something, which can work. I mean, it can be helpful to, you know, settle the mind down enough that we can explore a deeper sense of it. But it's still an effortful activity. When we use a mantra or a visualization or a phrase, we can do that, and it will settle the mind down. And that, like I say, that can be helpful. But as a long-term practice, like, well, I'll just keep doing it often enough in my life that it'll, it'll get me where I want to go. At least it'll quiet my mind a bit. Okay, I mean, if that's what you want, that's fine. We can use it in that way. But the invitation there is to see that, what is energizing this thought stream to begin with? Do we know? Right? I mean, I'd suggest that it is our fascination with it. Right? By fascination, I don't mean that it's always doing what we want it to do. Sometimes it's doing what we don't want it to do, but can't stop it anyway. If there's a problem that we can't solve and it just runs around and around in our head, and when we suffer because of it. So it can be either for or against, but there's still a sense of fascination, like, I will find the solution, I will find the payoff, I will find the pleasure in thought. I will use thought to determine whether my life is going well or not, whether I'm enjoying this moment or not, what life is about or not. So we depend on mind to interpret what we're actually experiencing. And we've sort of given over our authority to this mental structure. So it becomes the final judge and juror and prosecuting attorney and, over whatever it is that we happen to be experiencing. So we can see that. I mean, it's sort of painful to see, painful to admit to ourselves that maybe we are not actually in control of our thoughts, right? Everybody's admitted that to themselves. Yeah. Sounds like the first day of AA, I'm helpless to, I can't control my thoughts. If you could control your thoughts, you could just say, mind, I want to be quiet for the next 30 minutes, and then you can come back online, and that'll be fine. I just need 30 minutes, and your mind would be quiet for 30 minutes. If you could control your mind, you could do that. But we can't. We can't. So I'm not saying that that it's not possible for the mind to settle down over time, so that there are extended periods of silence. That's different than insisting that I'll evaluate my spiritual progress based on how much my mind is thinking or not. If we're not in control of it, the important thing is to acknowledge, if I'm not in control of it, then am I responsible for the content of it? I'm not talking about behavior here. I'm talking about the content of the mind. So behavior, yes, we have some ability to control that, evaluate it, take the higher road. But the content of our thinking mind isn't subject to that. And it's worth really looking at to realize that for ourselves, that it arises from somewhere and it stays in our consciousness for some period of time. The good thoughts may not stay there as long as we'd like, and the difficult thoughts might stay there longer than we'd like, but there's some lifespan, And then at some point, that particular line of thought drops back into, let's just say silence, okay? Drops back into silence, and another thought picks up immediately in maybe a slightly different direction, or maybe totally different. You know, takes us and runs with it. So when we're meditating, maybe for a long time, we can hear that there's a possibility of a mental space where thoughts aren't occurring, but for the life of us, we can't find it. You know, we try, we sit down, we're determined we're going to find that space, and the more we try, the more elusive that it seems, the more our mind seems to be thinking. So the question is, who is it that's actually trying so hard to be silent? Right? I mean, isn't that trying really hard just another thought about how I should be that's different than how I actually am in this moment? When the truth of the matter is, I'm here, thought is happening. I can recognize, if I really look at it, I can recognize quite quickly that I cannot control the content of my thinking. I mean, we can if we're, doing something external to us, if we're at work, working on the computer, doing something that's, you could say, sort of outside of our personal self. We can focus for a long time on that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just, when we're with ourselves, alone, quiet, in a room, what's the mind doing? What does the mind need to do in that moment? Nothing really, right? But that's not what happens. What happens is this train of thought goes on relentlessly, even when it's not needed. So it just churns memories and anticipations and fears and desires, hopes and dreams. All of that keeps churning in that space. So in a very real sense, it is noise that we've created in our own head. It wasn't there the first year of life. It's something that we've adopted and become fascinated with. We believe it, which is what gives it power. But if we stick it out, and stay with, be willing to just be with that mental freight train and just watch it go by. And if we're carried away by it, when we recognize that we've been carried away by it, just come back, come back to the breath, the feeling into the body, putting our hands on our knees, feet on the ground. So just something to bring us back to this moment. We don't want to punish ourselves, right? We don't want to punish ourselves for being lost in dreamland. By saying, oh, I should have been, I was supposed to be meditating and I was been lost in thought for the last 20 minutes. Bad meditator, bad meditator. No, I mean, it's a wonder that we come to at all, right? I mean, there's no guarantee that we would not be lost in thought endlessly, mindlessly for the rest of our life. So when we actually come back to a sense of recognition of being here, present in this moment, I mean, what draws us back? I mean, it's actually quite miraculous that we seem to be drawn back by some deep innate sense of who we are. We may have been asleep for 20 years. And then one day, we might find, oh, I wonder what's actually living this life. We come back to the present moment. Okay, so we're meditating day after day, weeks, months go by maybe. And then maybe we notice a little gap between two thoughts. Not much, just brief, second or two. And then the ego rushes in, pats ourselves on the back and says, well done, meditator, right? Now you're getting the hang of it. And of course, we're back in our head again. But what's really instructive, it's not so much that's proof of progress. That's nice, sure. But what's actually, I think, most significant about noticing even the slightest gap in thought is that in that moment, you continue to exist. You continue to exist in the absence of thought. Right? So what does that tell us? It tells us that who we fundamentally are, isn't dependent on thought. If it were and thought ceased, then we'd just cease to be. We'd vaporize in the moment that we stop thinking about it, thinking ourselves into existence. So the fact that we survived this gap in our thought stream means that who we fundamentally are isn't dependent on thought. If it's not dependent on thought in a moment, it's not dependent on any thought ever. If it's not dependent on any thought, it's also not dependent on any belief. It's not dependent on any opinion. It's not even dependent on any dogma. Right? What we are isn't subject to thought. This is good information, right? I'm not saying to believe it, but notice the consequence of that experience when you've experienced it for yourself, that you can exist without thought happening, even for a split second. The length of time actually doesn't matter. If we can see the actual implications of that, it's very, very significant. It takes away this certainty that the mind is the ultimate decider of what's real and what's not. It shows us something exists that's non-conceptual. It's not subject to whatever we think about it. There's a way to experience things that isn't dependent on words. So this is the very liberating experience that we can have let's say, in meditation. We can have it walking around, we can have it and I'd suggest we actually all have had that moment where our mind has stopped many, many, many times. But we don't give it that much value. We enjoy the experience, but the mind quickly comes in to describe it to ourselves or to the person standing next to us. It's like, did you see that bird fly by? The bird just flew by. That was the experience. It was so sudden, so close that our mind we're just there present for it. And then a moment later, we want to put it into a phrase and to describe the situation. I mean, obviously the description will never be as real, as awe-inspiring, as amazing, as full of life as the experience itself. But that's what we rely on. We rely on the verbal description more than the event. So it's just recognizing those moments when they happen. If they happen in meditation, that can be helpful because there's nothing else going on that we can, in a sense, be distracted by other than our thoughts. So when we catch on to these moments, the point isn't so much to have, more and better gaps in our thinking. I mean, that's nice, right? But the point is really to see how we drop into that more silent space between thoughts. It's not because we're trying to do it. That's almost, well, it is counterproductive. It happens when we're actually not trying to do it. But it happens when we lose our fascination with the thinking mind. The mind doesn't like that. The mind doesn't like to be dismissed. Right? So it'll use lots of tricks to sort of pull us back in. It'll come up with a story, well, wait a minute, there's this problem you haven't thought about for a while. How about thinking about that? Something to pull us back into its domain. Or the other tricks that it uses, it'll use sleepiness, right? I'll just check out. I don't want to just be willing to drop into the space where thought no longer is significant. So I'll just get sleepy, right? Or I'll get bored, this meditation, what's the point? I'd rather, it'd be much more interesting to be thinking about tomorrow, what I'm going to do tomorrow. So these are just tricks of the mind to try to rein your intention back in. So it's much more useful to actually see how the mind pulls us away from silence than to seek silence directly. Does that make sense? I mean, how are you going to seek silence? Any effort to seek silence denies its presence in the moment. It's like, I know how to get there, but what is it exactly that's trying to get there? What's trying to get there is this, goal-oriented, separate self seeking silence. It's not going to happen. The presence, silence happens in the absence of this personal self exerting itself into the situation. So it's much more useful to see how we're pulled away from it than to seek silence directly. It's counterintuitive, but it's much more helpful to sort of clear away the debris than to, see through the debris and what's actually there. Just see how we're being pulled out of that silence. The silence is present. Silence is never absent. So we don't have to seek afar for it. So this, what we've been talking about the last few minutes has been, the sort of the deeper level of silence compared to exterior absence of noise. Right now we're talking about moments where thought is absent, and there are the possibilities of these moments, or over time they may get longer, maybe, a whole meditation you might find has passed, and you might find that it passed much more quickly than you thought. You were sitting there and the bell rings and you realize that you weren't asleep and you also weren't thinking. There was a sense of being prior to thought. Okay, so this is another level of silence. Silence as the absence of thought. But there's even a deeper level of silence than that. It's the same silence, but it's a different experience of it. You know, and that deeper silence, I'd like to just call it true silence, is the silence that's not disturbed even by thought, not disturbed even by a man-made sound next door. So when we begin to recognize that silence as being present, a thought can arise out of it, fall back into it. A sound can arise out of it and fall back into it. Sound is possible only because silence exists. We can recognize sound only because what is recognizing that sound is silence, is who we actually are. You know, if what we are was just noisy, you know, it wouldn't have the perspective to recognize another noise. What recognizes a sound, recognizes a thought, is already quiet. Naturally, effortlessly. The effort is to get to the point of recognizing it, you know, being willing to look in the direction that is fruitful. You know, if we're trying to find silence in our mind, you know, sort of work out all the issues, you know, come up with a rationale in our heads about why silence is good, we'll never find it that way. Because the mind is fully engaged, fully empowered. Mind likes that activity. You know, what it doesn't like is just that. You know, it doesn't like the absence of thought. So we can use silence as a doorway, you know, through resonating with it as in a place of exterior quiet, out in nature, you know, being pulled into a non-conceptual space by seeing how we're, you know, tend to be pulled away from it by our patterning. So that's useful. You know, sitting down and being in a quiet room where not much else is happening, we could get a good close look at the mechanistic qualities of our mind. You know, we can recognize that we can't control the content of our mind. And then by seeing those gaps that may become apparent when we slow down enough to see them, that there's actually a gap between one thought and the next, we can relax enough that we're not on to the next thought and the next one just as quickly as we can. The gaps will tend to appear more frequently, and we can recognize their real importance as an opportunity to see what we are in the absence of thought. You know, what we are when we're not trying to make anything else happen. You know, a lot of times in meditation, you know, we're trying to get somewhere else. We're trying to get enlightened. We're trying to get peaceful. We're trying to have a really, really good spiritual experience. You know, we're trying to think good spiritual thoughts, not all those other thoughts. So we're always trying to do things. We're always trying to manage our experience. So and we can do that for a long time, actually. We tend to do it until we get frustrated with it, till we get burnt out of trying to manage that experience and realize that, you know, even after meditating 10 years, 15 years, you know, we still don't have the power to do that. We can control it to a certain extent. We can learn to do that, but it requires effort. As soon as we get up, walk away, you know, drive in traffic, you know, go to work, all of that effort may no longer be sufficient to hold us in that space. So what we're really looking for is that natural state of meditation, you could say, that natural being in silence. It actually is our natural state. So it's really coming back to what we already are. It's not, silence isn't something that we manufacture. It's not even something that we attain. Right? Not even something we get good at. Silence is just fine as it is. It's us with our preferences and desires and fears that pull us away from that. But what we are is already silent. Awareness is already silent. You know, when we are actually with that silence, you could say listening to that silence, we're not listening with the sense of, I want to hear something. You know, it may be really faint, but I want to hear it now. You know, I want to hear God say something to me. You know, I want to get instructions for how I should live my life. That's still ego talking. It's still wanting something that's not already present. By listening, it's really a very receptive state. It's listening in silence, listening without any demands on that space, with no insistence that it be a certain way. It's sort of, you can experience that even talking with another person. You know, if you're talking to the other person's just waiting for their turn to say what they think. You can tell they're not really listening to you at all, right? You know, true listening is just being present, being receptive, being open, being non-judgmental, being available, right? I mean, isn't that really what we would like in a friend? Somebody that is just, is there, you know, allows us to express whatever it is that we may feel. Beautiful. But that's what I mean by listening. Just listening with an openness, not demanding anything at the moment, not demanding that it be any different than it is, however it shows up. If it shows up with a busy mind, that's what it shows up as. It's actually very similar to awareness, right? Awareness is present. It's present for whatever the situation is, whatever shows up. It's not arguing with this should happen, that shouldn't happen. The mind may be, but the awareness itself is not. But from that accepting, present, spacious perspective, we could say, everything is available. So when we look at it from awareness, it looks like being present. When we look at it from silence, it's actually the same thing. You're just approaching it from a slightly different direction. But awareness is silence. Silence is awareness. So we can use silence. Silence is both something that we can use as a touchstone, you could say, to come back to awareness. I remember this story from Greek mythology today, and I'll end with this and we'll open it up for questions. But the story is of this Greek hero, Odysseus. He's coming back from, I think, a battle or something. He's captain of the ship, and they're sailing past this rocky island that's known to have sirens. So sirens are a mythological creature. They're mostly bird with a head of a woman. And they sing such enchanting songs to the sailors that are sailing by, that the sailors turn into the rocky island, the ships crash into the shore, and the sailors die. So Odysseus knows the story, knows the myth. But, you know, they're mythological creatures and he's a character in mythology, so he doesn't quite get that they're not real. Anyway, they're sailing by the island, and before they get there, he has all his sailors on his ship plug their ears with wax so they can't hear these sirens singing this song and be lured into this island. But he himself wants to hear the song, but doesn't trust himself enough not to be lured into the rocks and crash. So he has this, he gets himself tied to the mast of the ship so he can't be tempted to, you know, go into the rocky island. So that's the story. He survives, goes home. But what the story reminded me of is the allure of our thoughts. Right? It's the thinking mind and our fascination with it that pulls us away from silence, whether we're walking out in nature, whether we're sitting quietly. Those thoughts are so alluring. It's like the siren song. You know, if there was some way to mentally, you know, tie ourselves to the mast so we wouldn't be carried away by our own thoughts, you know, we'd probably give it a try. Anyway, that was an amusing story. So the final thing that I'd like to say about this silence is that ultimately it's not just about being quiet. It's not just about finding a quiet space where no thoughts happen. Really, the deepest silence is when we recognize that silence is still present, even while thought is happening. Even when we're driving to work, even when we're talking with someone. It may not feel that way at first, and it may not even always feel like this silence is in the foreground. Sometimes, you know, we're engaged in the activity that might be more in the foreground, but the silence is never absent. That's what we ultimately realize. The silence isn't dependent on sitting in a quiet room. It's not dependent on walking in nature. It is what we are. So what we are is what we are. So what we learn finally that not only is the silence a doorway into what we essentially are, but that it is what we are. It is what we are even when we're having a conversation, even when we're thinking, even when we're engaged in some other activity. It is still what we are. And that's the freedom of it. So it's no longer about effort. It's no longer about practice. It's about a recognition of what we are, what we fundamentally are, unavoidably are. So that's the joy of that discovery. That's the freedom of that discovery. That's the liberation of it, is to recognize that what we essentially are is already silent, is already free.